Hi, Peter Charles here, Hooked for Life Fly Fishing. And today we're going to look at fishing intermediate lines. Now I have an Airflow beach line. It's a full intermediate head. And I've got a 9-foot 5-weight, an IMX Pro, and a Loomis rod. And we're going to give it a try. I've got a black-nosed dace weemer on the end of this. And I'm just going to go through some tactics for fishing intermediate lines. Now the first thing we can use with intermediate lines is the height of the rod off the water. Right now I'm running the fly quite shallow because I've got my rod tip up in the air. I'm exposing more of the line to the current at a higher angle and it lifts the line. Now if I do the same thing but keep my rod tip low, I will actually keep the fly lower, because what I've done is I've reduced the angle that the water is meeting the fly line, so it pushes the fly line up less. So now I'm keeping the fly a lot lower. So the benefit of this is if you're swinging into shallow water, you can lift the line up and you'll raise the fly as you enter shallow water. Now something else we can do, which is really sneaky when it comes to rod angle, is we can actually put the rod underwater. And that will drag the line even further down. So if you're going into a deep pool, for example, and you just had an intermediate line on, you needed to get down farther, push your rod tip into the water, it will actually drop the fly and the fly line even further down. So that's pretty simple. Next, let's talk about the pullback mend. So immediately it hits the water, I try to orient the fly line closer to parallel with the current. And in the process, what that does is it reduces the swing speed, reduces the effective current on the line, and allows me to sink it even further. Now there's an extra element to that pullback mend, and it also involves dropping tension. So I make my pullback mend, and then I drop my rod tip down towards the water like that. In the process, I'm reducing tension on the fly line and the fly, which causes it to sink. If you reduce tension, you're allowing the current to take the line down at a reduced speed, and in doing so, you're reducing lift. That allows the line to sink. Okay, we do our pullback mend. Now, if I keep the rod tip behind the line, so the line is coming across the water before the rod tip, I'm actually adding tension to the line if I'm not dropping it. So in other words, if I'm just holding in position, I'm actually increasing the tension on the line. So in one sense, I was dropping the rod tip. In the second one, I didn't drop the rod tip. I kept it behind the line, and that will cause it to ride higher. Okay, we do our pullback mend. I drop tension, and now I bring my rod tip in front of the line, basically leading it across, and I'm continuing to reduce tension. And as a consequence, it will sink deeper. And because of that, I'm going to raise my fly line, or else I'm going to hit bottom over there. Now the sneaky thing we can do is feed some line in. Now we've just dropped the fly line as it starts to run down the current. The fly line will actually drop because I've taken the tension off completely by feeding in some line. Now the option we have is casting across the stream, making our pullback mend, and because we went across the stream, part of that drift down, there's very little tension on the fly line. The current is not pushing it up very much when we go right across the stream, so it has a chance to sink. And unlike sink tips, that when they come into the current, the sharp angle on the sink tip will cause it to lift as soon as it swings into the current. Because this is running at a shallower angle, it will tend to do that less. I'm not saying it won't do it at all. So going directly across the current, making that pullback mend, almost no tension. That thing is just dropping like mad right now. Now you bring my rod tip nice and low. Now I'm hitting bottom. I can feel bottom right now. So you see the difference. because I cast across stream. I made my pullback mend, reduced tension, let the whole thing drop. I was hitting bottom. And it's fairly deep in there. So just by managing your casting angle and managing your tension, you can really, really sink these lines. See, I've hardly got any tension on that. I'm dropping, 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 dropping. Now I'm really fishing right now. I'm still had tension if a fish hit over there. I could still feel it. Better bring my rod tip up. But I can really, really sink the line by doing that. Okay, what about going upstream? Now again, pull back mend. And you can see how I've got my rod oriented. Drop, 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 continuing to drop, continuing to drop. And there we go. Now we'll lift this up so it doesn't snag. Now, if this was intermediate running line, we have another option. I prefer floating running lines for rivers because the running line doesn't sink into the water and snag up on bottom. But because I have enough current speed here, I could get away with an intermediate running line. So I could use one in this flow because there is enough current speed to keep the intermediate line from dipping into the water too much. So if I was using an intermediate running line, one of the more interesting things is the further you cast, the deeper you go. And that seems a little counterintuitive, but if I make a really, really long cast with an intermediate running line, that whole running line is sinking. Keep in mind, in my video about sinking lines, I talk about equilibrium angles. It maintains that angle all the way down to the fly. So if the intermediate running line is sinking along with the head, it's maintaining that angle right from the rod tip all the way to the fly. So the further out you go, the deeper it gets. That doesn't work with a floating running line because the floating running line will keep the back end of the head up. But if you had an intermediate running line, it would certainly work. So a really long cast. Okay, pull back mend, feed some line. Now we're really getting deep. If this was an intermediate running line, not a floating running line. So let's recap that. Rod angle, how high the rod is above the water. Pull back mend, reduce tension or increase tension. You can lift or lower the fly. Casting across the current instead of down and using that first portion as a setup cast. So what happens is you cast over, almost no tension, you let it drift, it's sinking like mad as you let it drift, and then you bring it under tension about 45 degrees, and now it's nice and deep. If you cast further upstream, you can get an even more effect. And as I said, if you're using an intermediate running line instead of a floating running line, the farther you cast, the deeper you get. And considering a lot of river profiles are like this, where the bottom, the further out you go, the deeper it gets, that's a big advantage. You get it way over there, way out in the middle of the river, if it's a big river, and you do an upstream cast, let it sink, and it's a long cast, that fly is going to be really low, even with an intermediate head. So you can really, really get some interesting effects and control out of your line, out of the depth of your fly, just by managing things like rod angle, casting angle, and the tension you put on it, how much slack line you feed in. Tons and tons of things you can do. See, I just hit bottom. You know, that's deep out there. It's probably about 3 feet deep, and I hit bottom. So you've got to think about these things, that you can, just because it says intermediate on the box for the fly line, doesn't mean it's limited to, let's say, a foot under the water. How you control your rod tip angles, your casting angles, the amount of tension you put on, the amount of, free drift where you don't apply any tension or very little tension. By changing all these things, you can really change the depth that fly runs. And it becomes a very, very flexible line system to use. And the thing that's important to realize is because it runs at a very shallow angle, then it's less affected by changes in the current speed as compared to a sink tip. So I made a nice long cast. I made a pullback mend. Now I'm going to strip. If you're going to strip line, keep your rod tip low and just strip in. You're going to strip a streamer. And because of that equilibrium angle, the fly does not rise to the same extent that you would have with a sink tip. If I did that with a sink tip, the fly would be just a couple of inches under the surface in this current. But with the intermediate, it does stay down. So see, I'm feeding line. Whoops, hit bottom. You can see, just how, intermediate line, 3 foot depth, I'm hitting bottom. And look at the current flow. I mean, it's moving in here. And just using that low tension approach, I can get the fly and the line down low. Now, a couple of other things. I'm using one of my downforce flies, and the leader is about 10 foot of fluorocarbon. So that's helping my case too to get down. My fly is probably running a few inches below the depth of the fly line, and that helps me to get an extra few inches of depth, get a little closer to the fish, a little bit more separation between my fly line and the fish. And it becomes a more effective fishing tool. Okay, enough of this instruction. Let me see if I can catch a fish. Oh, got one. It's half decent fish, I think. Now, they fooled me last time. I thought I had a decent fish on, and it turned out to be something about a pound. So I'm not going to make any estimates on this one until I get it in the hand. No, it's about the size of a little bit bigger than yesterday, 2 days ago. There we go. Beautiful Grand River smallmouth. This is basically where they were 2 days ago, all down here by this rock. As I say, use a water load, slip line into the back cast, boom. Mend, feed some line in. I just felt it. Oh, got another one. And they're down by that rock. This is not a big fish, but they're so tough when they got a bit of current to work with. That's another nice little fish. Gives me a good fight on this rod. Okay, let's see if we can get another one. Now, one of the things, oh, got another one. They're all down by this rock. That black-nosed day swimmer is a very effective fly. I've got a video on it. Oh, this one seems to, powerful little fish, I'll tell you. This is quite a bit better. Good sized fish. Black-nosed day swimmer. Works like a charm. There we go, fishing an intermediate line. 3 cooperative smallies, my black-nosed day swimmer pattern. Geolumus 9-foot 5-weight Himax Pro, and an Airflow 5-weight beach line with a full intermediate head. Very effective for swinging flies, and you can get tons of fish on them. There's plenty of ways to manage the depth. Don't feel like you're limited by just using an intermediate. You can really get down when you have to. So give one a try. Cheers.